Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Just take a few seconds to let everybody in. There's quite a lot of you today. And we're delighted to host so many of you, and seem to be from some of the names. I think we've got a few international guests. You're welcome as well. Our chat is open, so feel free to go on, chat, and say hello and say where you're from. We always like to see where people are coming from. I should note that you've all been muted, and that's so that we don't have any distractions, that the speaker can speak with no distractions. I should also note, and you'll all be aware, that we're recording today's session. So if you don't want your face to appear in the recording, we'd suggest you stop the video, and then we won't have the pleasure of seeing your face. Today's speaker is Ms. Elise Bath, and Elise is speaking to us from, well, she's actually coming from up north in England, but Elise works she's a manager in the Vienna Holocaust Library. And today's event is being held in conjunction with Holocaust Memorial Day. Now, the main day is the 27th of January, but we like to hold our events 1 or 2 days earlier. So there's a whole program across Northern Ireland and the UK on HMD, and something for everybody. So Elise will be talking today about an archive that you may or may not be aware of, which is called the International Tracing Service Archive. And Elise is working on a project which is going to last 3 years, correct me if I'm wrong, and hopefully 5 years, sorry. And hopefully at the end of 5 years, Elise will come back and tell us how it all went. So without any more ado from me, I'm going to pass you over to Elise. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you for having me here today, and for inviting me to speak to mark Holocaust Memorial Day 2022. As Stephen mentioned, the actual day itself is the 27th of January, which was chosen to mark the date on which Auschwitz-Birkenau was liberated by the Soviets. I would encourage you, if you have the time and the inclination, to have a look on the Holocaust Memorial Day website. They have a memorial event on the evening of the 27th, which I think will be quite a moving event. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that if you'd like. What I'm going to talk about today is an archive that's called the International Tracing Service Archive, and how it's used and has been used historically to find information about individual victims of the Holocaust. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. So just one sec. Stephen, can you just confirm that you can see that and that's working?
Yep, I can see that. Yep.
Great, fab. Okay, so I will get cracking now. My talk is titled Fate Unknown, Tracing the Missing After the Holocaust. So as Stephen mentioned, I work at the Vienna Holocaust Library, which is based in London. We are one of the world's leading archives and libraries on the Holocaust, Nazi era and genocide, and we're actually the world's oldest institution dedicated to researching this topic. That's us there in the middle of that picture. We take our name from one Dr. Alfred Wiener, who is a German Jew born in Berlin in 1885, and that's him on the left there. After his return from fighting in World War I, he recognized a real rise in anti-Semitism in Germany, and also saw the danger posed by the growing Nazi Party. As early as 1919, he wrote a pamphlet called Vor Pogromen, which translates roughly as sort of prelude to pogroms, which outlined his fears about where this anti-Semitism could lead and what it could mean for the Jewish community and Jewish people. Wiener began gathering evidence of this growth of anti-Semitism throughout the 1920s, and he used it to try and undermine the Nazis, and he also produced his own material to try and counter their effect. In 1933, when the Nazi Party came to power, he recognized the very real danger that they posed to him and his family. And so he moved himself and his family, who are here on this picture as well, to Amsterdam, where he founded the Jewish Central Information Office. The JCIO continued to collect and share information about the Third Reich and the persecution of Jews in Germany and Europe. And its collections are actually now the basis of the Vienna Holocaust Library. After the 1938 November pogroms, it was clear that Wiener, his family, his staff, and the collection were still not safe in Amsterdam. And so Wiener began making plans to relocate the collection across to London. But there was not enough time. So he managed to get across and the collection got across. And actually the library opened on the day that Germany invaded Poland. But his wife, Dr. Margarete Wiener, and their three little girls, Miriam, Eva, and Ruth, were all trapped on mainland Europe. They were arrested and deported, first of all, to Westerbork camp, and then from there on to Bergen-Belsen. All four actually were released in January 1945 as part of a very rare prisoner exchange program. But unfortunately, due to the years of mistreatment and suffering, Dr. Margarete Wiener actually died on the train that was taking the family away from the camps. So throughout the war, Alfred Wiener and the library, they continued to collect material to provide intelligence to the Allied governments about the Third Reich. And then after the war, the library and its staff continued with their collection work and their research. So staff gathered eyewitness testimonies, for example, in the 1940s and 1950s. We were also one of the first institutions to gather evidence and material about the genocide of Roma and Sinti people by the Nazis and their collaborators. We provided significant evidence for the Nuremberg trials and more recently for the Deborah Lipstadt, David Irving court case. And today we continue to work as a research library dedicated to collecting, preserving and sharing information about the Holocaust, about pre-war Jewish life, comparative genocide studies, anti-Semitism, and so on. So this is our reading room. Anyone is very welcome to come and use the reading room and look at our collections. And we have on-site stores and off-site stores. So here's a couple of images of where we keep our material and our collections. Speaking of the collections, that we really do have some remarkable items, very rare materials. We have books that aren't available anywhere else. We've got a huge archive, photographs, documents, ephemera. We have some objects as well. One of the strangest objects we have is a board game called Juden raus, which means Jews out, that was produced just before the Second World War. And the point of the game is that children would gather up Jews and then remove them sort of out with the board game area. And it's just, it's a very visually striking, but also quite a horrifying item. So we do have, very interesting collections that I would, if you ever are in London and want to come and visit and look at them, please do come and see us. We have an exhibition space with changing exhibitions. Our current one is titled This Fascist Life, Radical Right Movements in Interwar Europe. And I think our next one is going to be on modern anti-Semitism. So we do have this changing exhibition series as well. As is the case with everyone, we're trying to move more online, especially in this sort of COVID area. So we have a large number of online events, things like book launches, lectures, panel discussions, which you can register for events, or you can have a look on our YouTube channel and see some of the previous discussions that we've had, which if you're interested, I would really recommend that. And obviously, this is all based in London, but we are trying to increase our accessibility, and to that end we're working hard to try and digitize a lot of our collections and make them accessible from anywhere in the world. So we have quite a few web pages now where you can read through the testimonies that were gathered in November 38, in the 50s and 60s. We have the Holocaust Explained is aimed specifically at children to try and explain what happened during the Holocaust and the Nazi era at sort of a child appropriate level. And I just want to briefly mention as well, this is our most recent project that we've only just launched in the last few weeks. It's called the Refugee Map Project. We have a web page where you can search through and explore collections and photographs and interviews with refugees from Nazism. And you can click through it and you can trace the family's paths of exile, really. There's films, interviews, copies of documents. It's a great resource that really humanises the refugee experience in quite a powerful way, I think. And I did have a quick look before I came on here, and there's 3 items connected with Belfast itself, with Gert Jakobowicz, I think was a child refugee. I think he was at Mill Isle Farm, but it's well worth a look. We're going to be adding more documents to that. So do, you know, if you're interested in looking at that sort of thing, please do check that out. So the main part of what I want to talk about today, though, is one of our digital collections. It's called the International Tracing Service Archive. I'll probably refer to it just as ITS throughout because it's a bit of a mouthful otherwise. So I've worked on this archive as a researcher and now the team manager for 5 years. And it really is remarkable. You know, even after 5 years, I'm still constantly surprised by the depth of information that you can find in this collection. And I'm really pleased to be able to talk about it with you today because it's a fascinating resource, and anything I can do to sort of raise awareness of it, I'm very, very excited about. So first of all, a bit of background to the ITS archive. As the Second World War progressed, it became increasingly apparent that a refugee crisis of enormous dimension was building on mainland Europe. Millions of people have been displaced, families split apart, communities destroyed. By the close of hostilities, innumerable people were somewhere other than where they wanted to be, whether this was incarcerated within the Nazi concentration camp system, where they were forced labourers, or simply refugees forced to leave their home by circumstances of war. The Allies recognised the need to try to organise and coordinate this massive group of people, and even before the end of the war had begun to trace and register missing people. These initial tracing efforts went through various changes over the coming years in terms of who was coordinating it, who was in charge. Was it the military that was in charge? Was it charities? Was it the Red Cross? The history and sort of the beginnings of ITS are quite complicated and convoluted. And I don't really want to focus on that too much today. But if anyone is particularly interested, get in touch, let me know, and I can point you in the direction of various readings about the early days of ITS. But suffice to say, like for today's purposes, all these various early tracing efforts coalesced into what became known as the ITS, International Tracing Service. Interestingly, though, many of the staff working initially to trace the missing were themselves refugees or survivors or displaced people. So one such woman was Senta Hertz, and this is, by the way, this is the ITS headquarters in 1946. So by this point, it's sort of coalesced, all these search efforts have coalesced into one body. So Senta Hertz, she was a German Jewish refugee who worked with one of the first Jewish relief units sent to Bergen-Belsen to help that camp's survivors. She wrote about their needs, quote, "There was one outstanding wish apart from clothing. Do help us to find our relatives. I heard from my brother or my uncle or so-and-so who lives at Camp Munich. Help me to go there," end quote. Evelyn Bark, who worked for the British Red Cross, wrote similarly, quote, "It was a colossal task to discover the surname, Christian name, date and place of birth, last known address, and next of kin of every single living person in the camp. It was absolutely impossible to get accurate information about the dead. I almost despaired at the seemingly endless difficulties. Information written on dreadful scraps of paper in a dozen languages. Thousands of people wanted to know whether we had found any trace of this or that missing relative or friend," end quote. I wanted to share those quotes because they're starting to give, I hope, a bit of a sense of the urgency of this work, the scale of the problem of trying to trace these millions of missing people, as well as the practical difficulties. This was a deeply challenging task. So I've got a couple of examples here. Here we have, in the photograph on the left, the little girl is Susie Talvey, and that is her mother, Sarah. On 17th of November 1948, Sarah wrote to the Tracing Bureau about the missing daughter, Susie. Susie had been born in Athens in 1937 and was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in June 1944. Sarah wrote to the tracers several times, desperate for information about her daughter, and this is just a little section from one of the letters. Have pity on me, an unhappy mother. The Nazis, those ferocious beasts, took from me my little daughter, the only child that I have. I pray with all my soul that you may find my little girl and the surviving children. My little girl is called Susie Talvey, born on the 18th of November 1937 in Athens. deported from Athens on the 20th of June 44 for Birkenau. Her father is one of the survivors of Birkenau. He is called Mayor, and me, the mother, I'm called Sarah. The photo was taken in 1940. And there's a lot of correspondence in the ITS archive between Sarah and the tracers, and it's awful to read, because the mother is just sort of increasingly writing these letters that are so desperate. She's so desperate to find the little girl, and she's sort of hanging her hopes on tiny little things, when in actual fact, you know, there's no trace of Susie ever being found. And by far the most likely explanation is that she was murdered. But you see these letters from the mother where she just sort of can't accept that. And in the absence of definitive proof in terms of sort of proving the death of Susie, Sarah sort of holds on to this hope. Another case of a parent searching for their child, and in this case it's an adult child, was one Vladislaw Lukrec, who's searching for his son Tadeusz. So Vladislaw wrote to the tracers in February 46 asking about his son's whereabouts. The son had been imprisoned in Auschwitz, Horshausen and Buchenwald, and his father is now sort of desperately trying to find out, did his son survive, and for his whereabouts generally. And again, there's all this correspondence in the ITS archive between the father and the searchers, but there's no information about whether any trace of the son was ever found, whether he survived, whether they were ever reunited. And you can see here there's this sort of awful formality and this awful politeness in how a lot of these letters are written. I end in the sincere hope that you will not refuse your assistance in this matter. I trust the importance of the matter will be my best excuse for troubling you with it. This sort of very moving and very quite dreadful to read formality and politeness, even sort of decades after the fact, still remains distressing. So over the years, after the close of the war, the tracing efforts, the efforts to find all these missing people, they gathered and they also produced a huge amount of paperwork. And that is what has become the ITS archive. The archive today contains over 30 million original documents related to the experiences of 17.5 million people, and also about 3,000 personal belongings of former victims of persecution. The physical documents and the effects are held in an archive in a town called Bad Arolsen in Germany. And in the mid-2000s, as part of ongoing efforts to increase accessibility to this archive and the collection, the vast majority of the documents were digitized, and then digital copies of the archives were sent to various countries around the world, and the Vienna Holocaust Library was given the UK's copy. We use the archive in three main ways in the library. So it's used to provide evidence and to inform internal research. So we'll find documents that we can put in our exhibitions. A colleague and I have just finished a paper on Roma and Sinti persecution, for example, that's evidenced entirely from the ITS. So that's one way we use it. We also have a number of researchers and academics who come in and use the archive to inform their research. So this ranges from undergrads right through to professors, and the range of themes that people have researched is really, it's vast, you know, going from something like the punishment block in Auschwitz, looking at gay victims, looking at death marches. There was one person who did like a really in-depth analysis of the Jewish population of Dresden. So basically any topic you would want to research connected with the Holocaust, the ITS is so vast and so useful and contains so much information, you're almost certain to find relevant material in the archive. The third way that we use the archive in the library, and this is what I spend most of my time doing, we use it to research the paths of persecution of individual victims of the Holocaust, usually on behalf of their relatives. So what I do is I'll search the archive for mentions of an individual person, and then I'll pull those documents, I'll translate them, I'll decode them, and then I'll write a narrative report for the family about what happened to their relative. There's quite a high demand for this service, and at the moment I'm the only researcher, which is a bit stressful. But we have just hired someone, so we're about to get another researcher in, which would be great. But there is a bit of a backlog at the moment. It works out roughly at, I think I research on average about 300 people a year. So it's there's a lot of work, there's a high demand still. We still have survivors coming to us who want to know what happened to them or their relatives. And then that's often used to claim pensions saved from the German government. So there's sort of legal ramifications of the work that we do still. But most often it is people who just want to know what happened to their relatives. And I'm happy to talk about this later if that's of more interest, sort of the work that we're doing now, if that's something that you want to hear more about later. So I feel like I've talked now a bit about the background of the archive. I've talked about how we use this, but I haven't actually shown you necessarily what's in the archive. So I'm going to talk you now through some examples of some of the documents. Sorry, excuse me a sec. So I tend to think of the material in the ITS archive as being able to be classified in two main ways. So you have Nazi documentation. So this is material generated by the Nazis and their collaborators, which we now repurpose as tools of research. And then there's post-war documentation. So I'm going to talk about the Nazi documentation first. So this is things like concentration camp records, transport lists, prison documents, that sort of thing. And I've pulled out a few examples. So some of the material is for individuals. So here we have a prisoner card for one Abraham Pasternak from Buchenwald concentration camp. Abraham actually survived the Holocaust. So you can see here that if you're trying to find out information about an individual, how useful a document like this would be. So on the left-hand side, we've got biographical information, name, date of birth, place of birth. You've also got here his brother's address. And on the right-hand side, you've got a physical description of him. And we even have a photograph here, which is quite rare in these documents. You can see here, though, that you can really begin to build an image of a person and their life. Often there is a signature. The prisoner's signature often appears here, which can be very, very meaningful and very moving for family members when it's sort of the last tangible trace of a relative. But these documents are useful in other ways as well. They also give information about the incarceration of the person that they're showing. So we've got his prisoner number here, which you can then use to research in other areas of the archive. His prisoner category, we know here that he's in Buchenwald. We've got his date of arrival to Buchenwald. We've got the fact that he came from Auschwitz. So you can see that what looks at first glance like quite a simple card actually is very, very important in tracing not only a person's path of persecution, but also giving a lot of detail and information about that person for their family. So that's an individual's card. There's also a lot of list documents. So this comes from Mauthausen concentration camp, and it's pages from their death book. So left-hand side here, you've got the details of individual prisoners. And on the right-hand side, you have their alleged cause of death and date of death. And I say alleged because one thing that we always need to factor in when we're looking at these documents is who created them and why. These were created by the Nazis, often to sort of obfuscate what was actually going on. So in this case, the reason I pulled these pages is here, you can see the cause of death. Well, actually, I don't know if you can see, it's quite blurry, sorry. It says auf der Flucht erschossen, so shot to death while trying to escape. And if you look here at the dates, it's all the 6th of September, 666 September, 7th, 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 7th. And all these men are allegedly shot to death while trying to escape, which just seems deeply suspicious. Causes of death in these books were often euphemistic. There would be many reasons for a guard to shoot a prisoner and claim that they were preventing an escape attempt. You know, maybe to claim the reward that a guard would get for foiling an escape attempt. It may have just been to pass the time. There's all sorts of eyewitness testimony of guards shooting prisoners for fun. But in this case, this is actually a massacre of Dutch and British SOE agents. So I just pulled this out because it's quite an interesting example of how you have to read against the grain of these documents very often, and that we can't just sort of take them as read. Another list document here. This is a list of men released from Buchenwald camp after the November 38 pogrom arrests. And yeah, so that's just some examples, just a couple of quick examples of the Nazi documents. But now the personal effects that I mentioned earlier, it's a really fascinating section of the archive, and I think it's a particularly emotive one. So these are items that were taken from people arriving into the concentration camps at Dachau and Neuengamme. There's also some items from the Gestapo in Hamburg and some others from unknown places. They tend to be small personal items, pens, ID cards, jewellery. There's a lot of watches and wedding rings. And these are held in the archive in Germany. And what they're doing out there is they're working really hard to identify the owners of these items and then try and return the items either to the owners if they still survive, or to the descendants of the original victims. And this is publicised in their campaign that's titled Stolen Memory. And if you Google it, or if you're interested, get in touch and I can send you the details about it. But it's a very, it's a very moving part of the archive. And when they actually find a descendant and are able to repatriate a belonging to the family, often that's the only trace of the lost victim. So it's a deeply impactful and deeply emotional endeavour. And I saw one where I think it's the woman's uncle had died, and they found his pen, and just having the uncle's pen back, the woman was saying it's like he's home again. So you begin to see sort of the emotional effect of this work and the items in this collection. So if we return now to documents rather than effects, the other main category of documentation in the ITS archive is post-war material. So this is stuff created either after the war in the immediate post-war period or in the years afterwards in the various displaced persons camps that were used to house refugees post-liberation. So this is people who are either unwilling or unable to return to their pre-war homes. So in this category of material is stuff like this. This is a care and maintenance file for a family of displaced persons who are requesting help from the International Refugee Organization. So they might be asking for financial assistance to emigrate, for help training so that they can get a job, or even just for sort of very basic sustenance and support. But you can see here, it's a huge amount of detail here. We've got the names, dates of birth of the members of the family. You've got where they want to go. Are they willing to go back to where they were from? No, they're not. Their education. And then if you go on to the next page, you can start to see, school experience, what languages the family speaks. You can also see it's an absolute nightmare to read some of these documents, which is something that is a factor quite often. But you can see as well that if I'm trying to recreate what happened to an individual person or a small family group, how vital these documents are, and in really giving a lot of detail about what happened to people. There's also things like this, certificates of incarceration. These were tended to be created in the 60s often, and they were used to demonstrate that a person was entitled to compensation, say. There was a lot of legal considerations after the Holocaust that I'd never really thought about before I started this job. Like, what if your spouse has disappeared and not returned? Are you technically widowed? Can you remarry? If you're a child and your parents have gone, can you inherit? There's all these sort of legal ramifications which ITS research was also involved in. Then there's again individual documents. This is Elie Wiesel's Displaced Persons card, Elie Wiesel being the author of Nacht or Night, the autobiography, which if you haven't read and you're looking for an autobiography to read from the perspective of the Holocaust survivor, I would very much recommend. It's very powerful. And again, you start to see you've got the basic biographical information, you've got his parents' names, you've got where he wants to go at this stage. So again, it's all these little tiny documents where you get these details and can really begin to build a picture. And this, I think it's the last one I'm going to show you just now. This is from 1951, this document. It's a ship's manifest showing people from a displaced persons camp going from Germany to America. And I just wanted to pull this one out because I think it's really interesting to see how long this lasted. This was absolutely was not a case of sort of liberation. The camps been liberated at the end. This whole situation with all these millions of displaced people went on for years after the close of war. And even there, you've got like little 15-month-old. So this little Heinrich, born in the displaced persons camp, has never known anything else. This was an ongoing and long-term problem that needed a lot of support. So that's sort of what's in the ITS and how we use it at the library. what I wanted to do was sort of think about who I was talking to and think about PRONI. So I was actually in Belfast in November for an event at the Linen Hall Library, which was great. And while I was there, I came across the PRONI to have a look at some of their collections. And I was particularly interested in a collection of documents which were applications, mainly from Jewish business people and mainly living in the Vienna area. And they were applying for visas to set up businesses in Northern Ireland. And I will just say now, I did not have long in the PRONI reading room. So this is by no means a comprehensive survey. I literally had about, I think, 20, 25 minutes. So it's just sort of some impressions that were gathered quite quickly over a short space of time. I do hope to come back and look at these documents in much more detail in the future. But from what I could see, so with that caveat in place, from what I could see, a lot of the applications came from 1938, 1939 time, by which point Vienna was really quite a dreadful place to be Jewish. So following the Anschluss in early 38, you've got increasingly severe laws against and mistreatment of Jewish people. So this is in things like economic, in terms of losing businesses, but also things like this. You've got scenes of public humiliation. You can't use the parks. You can't sit on the benches. There's this sense of escalation, which builds up to this sort of a frenzy of violence in November 1938. Kristallnacht is how it's often referred to. And I think with Kristallnacht, November 38 pogrom, there's a bit of a misapprehension of it being, smashed windows, broken glass, Night of the Broken Glass, that's how it's referred to. But it really was far more than that. It was, over 30,000 Jewish men and boys were arrested and sent to various concentration camps. There were hundreds of people were murdered, violent home invasions, destruction of property, personal, like the image that you've got here now, where, houses would just be completely ransacked and destroyed. But also public spaces as well. So synagogues burnt to the ground. And you can see in this picture here that the fire brigade are there, the fire brigade are on site, but they're not putting out the fire, they're just making sure it doesn't spread to neighbouring non-Jewish buildings. And of course, then you do have the smashing of the destruction of businesses as well. But you've got sort of countless rapes, countless sexual assaults, murders. This is a dreadful time. So you can absolutely see why so many people submitted these applications to try and flee. And some of these applications were the new industry scheme in Northern Ireland, which is the documents that I saw in PRONI. So these documents in PRONI, they gave some identifying information about the applicants and what businesses they were proposing to set up, and also whether or not the application had been successful. So there was a Frederick Schwartz who unsuccessfully applied to set up a business specialising in fishing tackle, Alois Mandel, who was a linen and cotton manufacturer, whose application in August 38 was rejected. And from the cases I saw, the vast majority were rejected. In fact, I think every case I looked at, all of the applications for people to come to Northern Ireland were rejected. But as I said, I didn't have a chance to look at that many. But it did make me wonder what had actually happened to these people after they had failed to be granted visas to come to Northern Ireland. What happened after this rejection? And so I turned to the ITS archive to try and find out. And it turned out this was actually a really good example of how the ITS can be used, and how at times it can provide real clarity as to the experiences of people caught up in Nazi persecution, but also that often there is absolutely nothing, and that people have just disappeared entirely and that their fates are unknown. So I'm going to talk about 3 of the applicants that I came across in the PRONI reading room. So some managed to escape elsewhere. So there was the Lemkas. In July 1939, one Gerhard Lemke, who was a businessman originally from Berlin, and he made an application under this new businesses scheme to obtain visas for himself, for his wife Eva, and his stepson Peter Ziffra to move to Northern Ireland and open a shoe and slipper manufacturing business. The request was denied, but when I looked through the ITS archive, I found a post-war document listing Jewish refugees in Shanghai. And the Lemkas are listed down here at the bottom. There you go, in a bit closer detail there. And what this actually shows us is that not only did Gerhard, Eva and Peter get out, but also Gerhard's mother, Mina, was able to escape as well. And you can see here that they managed to get across from Berlin as late as 1940, and they travelled to Shanghai aboard the SS Rosso. And here are the relatives who are sort of standing for them after the war, and they're saying, you know, they can come to us, or that's where they're aiming to go. And there's the confirmation that Gerhard was indeed a shoe manufacturer. So again, as with almost every document in ITS, at first glance you think, well, there's not that much information here, but actually it really is the beginning of a trace of research. It really is the beginning of a path to kind of spread out and look elsewhere. Other rejected applicants were less fortunate than the Lemkas. There was the Hymen family. Siegmund Hymen, who was born on the 1st of November 1880, he applied for a visa to come to Northern Ireland in July 1939, hoping to set up a millinery business. The application also included that his wife, who's either Helena or Elena, depending on which document I'm looking at, and his son Hans also be granted visas. And it also mentioned two younger women, Elfriede Hitscher and Erna Streifler, who are described as model milliners, who were also named in the ultimately rejected application. When I went to ITS to look for information about these people, there was nothing from the time of Nazi persecution about them, but there were 43 pages of post-war material which reveal part of the story. So it seems that after their application to Northern Ireland was rejected, the son Hans fled Austria very soon afterwards, and he went off to Italy, entered the country illegally, and was eventually detained in a camp there. So you've got here, I've just pulled out a couple of, because there's 43 pages, I just pulled some little snapshots. So you can see here the date that he left Germany and the reasons behind it. He doesn't want to go back to Austria after the war because he's worried about the communist danger. He wants to go to America. Here again is another example of some of the difficulties of ITS research. Working through penmanship like this is bring its own challenges. So Hans managed to survive. The parents, Sigmund and Elena, they stayed in Austria for a little bit longer, but they also fled for Italy, and they lost their business and tried to live off their savings, but ultimately gave up and came to Italy. Both were also incarcerated in the camps, and Sigmund died there. So here you have Elena's post-war documents, and it's just here where they say lived at Vienna, Austria as housewife together with her husband, who was a merchant. After Germans occupied Austria, their shop was seized. They remained at home, lived by their savings. She went to Italy with her husband. And then if we jump down to July 1940, we can see the subject husband died. So Sigmund did not survive the war. His wife and son did. And I could find absolutely no mention at all in the ITS archive of the two younger women, the model milliners, Elfriede Hitscher or Erna Streifler. It may be that, you know, they may have got married, they may have changed their name, there might be traces of them if I knew more about them, but from the research that I've done now, they're one of those, well, they're two of those people whose fates are unknown. Despite the vast size of ITS, there are still these awful blank spaces where there's no information about people. And then the final case I'd like to talk about is the Hotholts couple, Georg and Jenny. So they were Georg Hotholts, born in 1882. He applied in 1939 to set up a business manufacturing slippers in Northern Ireland. And he actually lived with his wife Jenny in Berlin at this stage. So they weren't coming through the Vienna link, but via Berlin. The request was denied, but unlike the Lemkas or the Hymens, the Hotholts couple were unable to flee. Georg was one of 1,838 people deported from Berlin to Auschwitz-Birkenau on 1st of March 1943. Of the men on this transport, 150 were selected for slave labour in the camps, but given his age at the time of deportation, it is very unlikely that Georg will have been one of them. and he's there. This page comes from the deportation list, and there's Georg Hotholts. So I've also checked the records in the ITS from Auschwitz, and there's no mention of Georg Hotholts in them. So this means that it is most likely that he was murdered in the gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau on the 2nd of March 1943. And his wife Jenny was deported a few days later. She was one of 662 people deported on the 6th of March 1943, again from Berlin to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And there she is on the deportation list. Given of the women on board that deportation, only 6 were selected for slave labour in the camp, and given her age at the time, she will not have been one of them. And if Jenny survived the deportation, and there's nothing on the documentation to suggest that she didn't, Jenny will have been gassed to death on the 7th of March 1943 in Auschwitz-Birkenau. So I really wanted to talk about individual people today. I didn't just want to talk about the ITS archive as a historical source. And don't get me wrong, the archive is absolutely an incredible resource for really detailed historical research. It offers important opportunities for significant and valuable research. Thinking about these cases, even the PRONI cases, the new industries visa applications that these people were trying to escape, there's all sorts of valuable research angles to consider there. So the people who submitted these applications, they had the professional resources, they had the education, they had the language capabilities, and the financial resources to be able to submit these applications and try to escape. So not only to do that, they've already identified the significance of the threat that's facing them, and they can then use these advantages to try and escape. So we're identifying here there's an intersection of things to do with like professionalism and class and resources and survivability. So this is really sort of interesting historical work, and actually the issue of class and the Holocaust is very much a research area that's coming to the fore at the moment, and the ITS can absolutely help with that. But while the ITS is fantastic for this really granular, sort of close, sort of historical close-up research, this is this very, very detailed work. But for me, that's not really the main issue with ITS, and it's not its main strength, and especially not today on Holocaust Memorial Day. I think the most important thing about the ITS archive is the focus that it brings on individuals. So what it can tell us about individual people who were caught up in the Holocaust, not as one of 6 million, but as Georg Hotholts, as Susie Talvey, as Jenny Hotholts, as Sigmund Hymen. You know, we can name and identify these people on an individual basis, and people who, more often than not, they don't have a grave, they don't have a memorial, there's nowhere where they can be remembered. And saddest of all of those people that no one is looking for, because they were killed alongside their entire communities and their entire families, and there is no one searching for them and there is no one missing them. But here in this archive, they are still listed and they still exist. And I think for me, that is sort of the main strength of the ITS archive, is that it acts as this memorial, this monument of paper, really. Okay, thank you very much. That was all I wanted to say today.